Now let me explain what it is to be an enemy alien who is an enemy. When nations declare war on one another, they declare the citizens on their territory, respectively, enemies. They are enemy aliens. And normally, you incarcerate, when you start a war, the citizens of the country with which you are at war. You incarcerate them, you throw them into internment camps, which are like prison camps. That is, in the First World War, what the British did to whatever Germans happened to be in England in August 1914, and what the Germans, and presumably the Austrians, did at the same time with the British citizens on their territory. Now, in 1939, when the Second World War broke out, the situation was a little complicated because the British had, I don't know, 80,000, 90,000 nationals of Germany, the country with which they were about to be at war, on their territory, who were refugees from the country with which they were about to be at war. They were the first victims of the dictatorship which the British were fighting. So the British had a bit of a problem. They couldn't do what they had done in 1914, just round them up, have the police arrest them and throw them into internment camps, which in 1914 was mainly the Isle of Man, which is a little island between England and Ireland. In 1939, the British didn't know what to do, and the Home Office was particularly concerned for humane reasons, good, sound, honourable reasons, that the people who had sought asylum in England should not be treated like enemies, like enemy aliens. And so they tried very hard to spare them that fate. They interned, right at the beginning of the war, in September 1939, those who they thought were not refugees. They had some reason to distrust them. They could be spies. And there were a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, 100 I would think, who were in fact incarcerated. And as for the rest, they established an elaborate procedure, kind of a judicial procedure, in order to establish whether they were refugees or not. Now, I was in England. I had already been in England for 5 years. I went to England from Germany as a refugee. I went to school for 2 years, from 1935 to 1937, a perfectly good school, a public school in England, where I learned English. And then, in 1937, I went to Cambridge to study economics and law, which I did. And in the fall of 1939, the war broke out in September. In the fall of 1939, or in the winter between 1939 and 1940, I, like many thousands of others, were interviewed by a kind of tribunal, and it was established by a very nice man that I was a good, honourable citizen. I mean, citizen is perhaps not the right word, a person who was on English territory, who was most certainly not a spy, but a genuine refugee. In fact, the gentleman who interviewed me, this was in a kind of tribunal, asked me whether I had been playing cricket at school, and when I said, well, of course, he said, well, I'm convinced you're a genuine refugee, which in fact I was. In a few weeks later, in the, I think, March 1940, I appeared before a recruiting board at my college in Cambridge, and I was interviewed, and they had a That's what there was. I think it was a 3-man board. They had a file in front of them from the Home Office, and then they interviewed me, and after I answered a few questions, which I can't remember, they said, "Oh, yes, you are obviously officer material." And they wrote a document, which I still have, which says that I was officer material to serve probably in the infantry, in the British Army. However, in May 1940, the Nazis invaded Holland and Belgium. You may remember that for the first 6 months of the war properly had not broken out in the West. And the Nazis invaded Holland and Belgium, and the British suddenly understood that the war was going to be very serious indeed, because if Holland and Belgium fell, France might be the next victim, and then there was a danger, and a very real danger, of an invasion. And so that on May the 10th, the Nazis invaded Holland, and on the 11th, Mr. Chamberlain, who had been Prime Minister of England until then, and who was called an appeaser with some reason, lost his job, and Winston Churchill took over on May the 11th, and wanted to make it very clear from the very beginning that a new phase began, that the kind of appeasement was over, that things were going to be very tough. And in the very first cabinet meeting, which he held on May the 11th, it was decided to intern the enemy aliens near the coastline, because if there was an invasion, then these people, whoever they were, might be fifth columnists, or might work together with invading Nazis. Therefore, the coast was important. On May the 12th, I went to a very nice party at a girls' college for sherry, or maybe it was a tea party. Anyhow, it was a party in the afternoon. There had been rumors. I had heard rumors, and about possible internment. And then when I went to my room, my digs in Cambridge, I found 2 very nice bobbies waiting for me, and my landlady, Mrs. Ripley. Mrs. Ripley was extremely upset because she was given to believe by these 2 bobbies that she had been harboring an enemy alien and possibly a German spy. And she was not amused by that. Also, she was concerned about her rent. Mrs. Ripley was very worried that perhaps the enemy alien had not paid, but she was going to defraud her of her rent. Anyhow, these very nice gentlemen, bobbies, were very polite to me. They called me sir, which the police in other countries would not have done. And they said they were terribly sorry, and they were afraid that they had to ask me to come with them. Now, the problem was, it was about 3 weeks before my final exam in the spring of 1940. This happened, you see, May the 12th. That was May the 12th. My final exams in law were to be held at the end of May. And my main concern was, what am I going to do? Am I going to take my notes with me? How long was I going to be incarcerated? And I asked rather nervously. I asked the police, and they reassured me that it was only for a weekend. I should take a pair of pajamas and maybe a toothbrush, and I would be out within a few days when they cleared up all this mess. And, well, so I put a few things in the suitcase, and my mother was in London. And I asked the police whether I was allowed to call her. And the police said they were terribly sorry, sir, but this was unable, it was against all the rules. And I said, could I write a note to my mother, and I would post it on the way to the police station or wherever they were going to take me. And they said they were terribly sorry, but they couldn't do that, but they would be delighted to post the little letter for me en route. And so I wrote a little note to my mother, which I still have. It's a historic document, which the police very kindly posted on the way. And so I put my things into a suitcase, and they took me along. I can't really remember very much about that drive. And they took me to the area in front of the Senate, the Cambridge Senate, right at the center of Cambridge. And there were a lot of people already milling around, and other cars and trucks had been delivering people like me. There were altogether 80 people. And then we were taken to a camp near Cambridge in Bury St. Edmunds. And that is my first of several camps, and I was then incarcerated altogether for a year and a half. First for a few weeks in England, and then later in Canada. And about that, I may be able to talk on another occasion.